Welcome back to another episode of Reading Rehab. I am Mike Brown, joined by,
Brian Gardner.
and no Pat Healy today because he is on vacation. So,
Lucky
just us.
him.
We are talking about, yeah. He also told me today that he just got his third target score for the NPTE, so he's in a good spot for later next month. But
Nice.
we're talking about dose-response modeling of resistance exercise across outcome domains, strength and conditioning, a meta-analysis. This came out in February of this year, 2024, in Sports Medicine. Yeah, and I guess just hopping right into it with the introduction. The first thing I had highlighted is they're talking about prescription of resistance exercises requires consideration of a range of acute program variables, including volume, intensity, frequency, and other more subtle variables, including exercise selection and exercise order. Just saying, like, there's a lot of different things we can manipulate. So I guess the point of this paper was to see, like, how those things that we manipulate impact the training. So then they also look at it according to training status as well. We're back after a quick break. So just as I was saying, that they had different training statuses there were three different ones. If you were new to it, so less than a year, then like recreational 1 to 5 years, and then highly trained greater than 5 years. But yeah.
Yeah, and then they also went into the intensity and defining high intensity as loads above 80%. And then for low intensity, it was around 60%. So yeah.
Yeah, and they also defined higher volumes of 8 sets per muscle group and load in intensity of load intensities. 85% of 1 rep max. They do have a really nice table, like way further on too, table 1, that kind of codes everything, like how they coded it for the different domains they have, which we'll talk about, which also has a volume categorization of low, medium to high for all the different training modes, because there's a lot of heterogeneity with all the different articles that they're reviewing in the introduction. But they did say that higher training frequencies resulted in greater improvements in strength, but that these increases appear to be primarily mediated through increased weekly volume. So it's, in theory, you can be training less frequently, but more sets, and still see big benefits from that. But since there's so many different that's of this meta-analysis is to investigate resistance training participant characteristics in a range of outcome domains. The 5 outcome domains they talk about are maximum strength, power, vertical jump, change of direction, and sprint performance. Yeah. Did you have anything else in the introduction?
No, actually not. I think you hit mostly key points with that. So I think it's going on to the methods. I really didn't have much. They did a meta-analysis. Just a bunch of databases were taken. They did have some inclusion criteria. Again, this is what they included was any resisted training or majority resistant training based studies of greater than 4 weeks. The second criteria was healthy, trained or untrained participants with a mean age between 14 and 60. Third criteria was training groups with a minimum of 4 participants. And then they also had a pre and post training means and standard deviation. And the final criteria was sufficient information provided, quantifying training as intensity, volume, and frequency. So,
yeah.
And I think that's.
You can finish. You have a thought.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's it. They didn't give anything that like excluded any sort of studies, at least in this section. But they also were looking at studies, and they defined like participant characteristics, outcome domains, training doses, pre and post mean standard deviations were obtained. And then they kind of looked at defining, or they use definitions used to categorize outcome domains was maximum strength, which is, again, max force production. They looked at power, which is that direct measurement or indirect estimate of mechanical power output measured in watts. Jump performance measured in height or distance. Sprint performance measurement in time to complete a specific linear distance or velocity achieved. And then change direction performance was defined as a measurement of time to complete a non-reactive change of direction or reactive task. And then they kind of define your training status, which is, again, just that untrained is less than a year, like Mike said, recreational 1 to 5, and then highly trained was greater than 5 years.
Yeah. The only thing I have on those is it's just funny to me that they use vertical jump as an estimation of power, but then jump performance is also its own domain. So it's like jumping's kind of double dipped.
Right. I mean, that's, again, just looking at it. I mean, how you just, I guess, test for lower body power is you do have to leave the ground, which is defined as a jump.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. But then this is where they get table 1. There's a lot on here, so I won't go over all of it, but the volume is just like they define all of them low, medium, or high volume. It's based on number of, like for sprinting and change of direction, number of runs, plyometrics, number of foot contacts, resistance training, and ballistic stuff, average number of reps. So
I was very confused as well. Yeah, I was very confused on combined because it's not like you could compare too much of the other ones. I mean, obviously it's combination of resisted, sprint, ballistic, plyometric, and agility training all in one. So it's like, how many can you really throw into that that are going to be comparing each other like simultaneously? So I thought it was weird that they included those instead of being, this was about sprint performance, this one was about plyometrics. So that was just the only thing that I thought about that table was interesting.
Yeah. I didn't look too much into that, to be honest, because then they really didn't talk about low, moderate, or high for each of these very much. No. So I don't know.
No.
But then they had a whole section on the statistical analysis, which is way above my head.
Yes. Same. I didn't really dive in. I didn't even really dive into that one. I think that's, again, usually when you're doing research, you have someone that's very interested in stats, run the stats. But that's just from my own experience.
Yeah. And I feel like the only thing I highlighted was just that they had a nested 4-level mix effects meta-analytic model, which I don't know what that means, but maybe someone listening knows.
It sounds important.
Yeah, I'm like, they know what it means, so that works.
Right.
So going to the results, because we don't really understand a lot of the results because we don't understand what the analysis is. I think the description of data is the most important part of this section. So they had a total of 295 studies, which is a lot, but that translated to only 6,710 participants, which is still a lot, but I would think with that many studies, you could have a lot more than that. But oh well.
Yeah, but I think that was because some of their inclusion criteria was something, it had to be more than just 4. So like if there were 5 participants, it was technically included.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why it's barely a study, but
yeah.
yeah. Then they also restricted their analysis to less than 26 weeks following a baseline test, because I guess one study must have been 208 weeks long, which is so
It's a very
long.
dedicated study for that length of time.
Exactly.
I thought it was very interesting looking at it from like a gender difference, like the number of studies that was only 12% categorized as females only. So like obviously we don't get there's a big, like, I guess for that amount of studies and that amount of participants and the amount of research that goes into it, like the fact that we only have 12% were female only, I thought that was very interesting. Because there's obviously something missing there in the literature review when it comes to like analyze dose response.
Yeah, and that's something they talk about in their limitations too, that like that's just kind of where strength and conditioning research is. Like there's not a lot on female only. And they definitely cited that as a limitation because maybe there is a difference that they wouldn't be able to pick up. But yeah, then the next couple sections won't really go into. There's a lot of numbers, but they just to go over the headline, the like titles of each of them. There's the null model, the level 2 predictors, level 3 predictors, level 4 predictors, cross-level interactions between 3 and 4. You can definitely read those if that's to your fancy, but I think we would just be like butchering anything that it actually means. So we'll just go down to discussion.
Yeah. And I think like, again, Mike and I both understand that like, obviously this stuff is important to be able to kind of give this sort of like a study, but not saying that just because we're skipping it, it's not important. It's something that we're trying to provide you with little tidbits to take away. And if you really want to get into more the nitty gritty and you're into that sort of research aspect, and this is definitely a good one to kind of start with because it, it's just something that you could like look at and hopefully understand more than Mike and I do. So
yeah, I feel like this could be very good to study to learn more about the stats of meta-analyses, if that's what you're into as well. But yeah, going into the discussion, let's see, they say the analyses identified that a range of factors are associated with the magnitude of change. Factors include length of intervention, outcome type, volume, overall intensity of training, and the intensity of load. The analyses also had important interactions between loading intensity and outcome domain, such that some outcomes are more likely to experience greater improvements with a range of sub-max loads. I feel like that's probably one of the biggest like takeaways from this article too, and that's like what they spend a lot of the discussion talking about as well. figure 3 is a really nice figure that we'll definitely get to as well. So then the other highlight I have is, despite relatively short intervention durations, the results show substantive improvements can be made, and that longer durations within these timeframes create greater mean improvements. So you can see pretty big change in just 8 weeks, but then obviously the longer you're doing it, the more change you're going to be seeing. Yeah, do you have anything else in that first bit there?
No, not really. I think you hit all the good little points. I think it's, again, going based on like trying to add this to like a clinical side of it. It's obviously you're going to have a patient in front of you and have to determine how many weeks that this person's going to be with you. So I think that's where you have to take that in consideration when using specific dose response. Because if you only have them for, say, 4 weeks, then it's a little bit different or challenging. When you have a little bit more time, then you're able to kind of, again, just kind of continue to see progress through that. So I think that's a way to kind of look at it, is how much time you have, and then where do you need to kind of manipulate these variables in order to get what you're looking for and the response you're looking for.
Yeah, that also could help, like, I guess, with sales as well, to say, to like market yourself, to say like, hey, you should be working with me longer, because research shows that you get more benefit from going longer, but then you can see a lot of benefit in 8 weeks. So let's like do at least 8 weeks, you know?
I also think like it's not just a sales for just the individuals. If you're in a cash based, but it's also a potential for, if you have to try to fight with insurance to kind of just like to get something extended potentially. So that's something that could be brought in front, especially when you're writing progress notes for insurance, to be able to say, okay, this person's only been here. I know you're only going to give them so many visits, but this is more ideal to be able to kind of see better improvements. And I know that that's a tough thing when it comes to the insurance companies, but it's sometimes you can use the research in order to kind of give yourself a little bit more to stand on when it comes to being an advocate for your patients or clients.
Yeah, that's a great point as well. Yeah, I think while we're on this page, figure 2 is also on this page, and I think they do a nice, like, it is a nice looking figure, and it shows pretty elegantly what they're trying to get at. So it is a table with, on the x-axis is effect size, on the y-axis is the 5 different domains, and they're just saying that strength has the highest effect size with resistance training. Like, the resistance training has the greatest effect on muscle strength. Then back a little bit, jump, power, and change of direction are all like relatively similar. And then sprint has the lowest effect size. There's still, like, technically, when you look at effect sizes, it's still like a small to moderate effect size. But the authors say later, I can't remember where, that they attribute that to sprinting being more of a skill that you have to learn by doing it, where, like, resistance training, a lot of our testing to measure strength is by doing resistant exercise. It's like a 1 rep max back squat. So you're like doing the test for it. So that could help with like skill acquisition too, as well, to show that your strength is better. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, then with the next page, they have they say the current meta-analysis demonstrated varying effects across multiple outcome domains, commonly targeted with the greatest effect sizes, for strength and lowest for sprint performance. So that's what they were saying. That's what I was saying earlier. In that, again, the transference between improvements and long-term adaptations in strength and conditioning is dependent primarily on the training principles of specificity, progressive overload, respectively. So that's why sprint training, you probably don't get as much from it, from purely resistance training as you would with strength. So then I think we can go into figure 3 too, unless you had something else to add on to that.
No, I don't. I think the reason why sprint is, like we may have mentioned, it's very specific. I think that's the reason why the effect size is not really the highest compared to strength training. I think you'll see a lot more studies also done looking at resisted training than you will like sprint training, at least in my searches in my career at this point. So might be just a way if we look at this a few years down the road, that hopefully that could be potentially a little bit better. I think our technology has also improved a little bit, so it could be another reason why like the effect size isn't as accurate.
So then going into figure 3, I also think they did a nice job with this.
Lots of pretty colors.
Yes, it definitely looks good. I think, to me, the essentially line graphs are the most important parts from this. They do have other graphs like on top of the line ones that show that they're density plots. So like I think how many studies look at that variable, like that intensity. So they're looking at effect size on the y-axis, intensity on the x-axis. And so what we see is for strength and sprinting domains, you have a larger effect size. With strength, it looks almost linear too. As intensity increases, same with sprinting. With change of direction, there's like a little dip in there, but it's mostly flat. So it seems like intensity really doesn't change a whole lot for the effect size. With jumping performance and power performance, we see actually you want a lower intensity, where for jump, especially like less than 50, that's where you start seeing the highest effect sizes, 50% of max. And for power, you see that like 50 to 60% of your max is like the top of that curve, and then it starts going down as you get higher.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this off air of maybe potentially it's velocity dependent when you're training these two variables. So I think, again, and we also talked about how they're very similar, like how jumps and power were almost like the same category or domain that they use. So I think that's a reason why you're seeing very similarity between that jump and power, especially with like the intensity or percentage of max 1RM.
Yeah, and then let's see where is all that stuff. They see because then the analysis is later. They say its current meta-analysis suggests improvements in change of direction are likely to be of similar magnitude to those measured during the jump. And tasks focusing on the development of power, but with more uncertainty too. So I feel like all three of those kind of get at like fast contractions and especially change of direction, like reactivity a little bit. Obviously, sprinting, you have some very fast contractions as well. So a lot of overlap with the domain as well. But yeah, I guess looking at some of my later highlights, when prescribing intensities, practitioners should consider training intensity beyond simply intensity of load. For example, like ensuring maximum intent with some of the ballistic exercises. So like jumping, you could hold weight too, but you could also manipulate the intent. So like, okay, you're going to try and jump at like 50% of your max versus like, I want you to jump as high as possible, sort of thing. Yeah, do you have any other highlights in this first bit going into the end?
No, not really. I think, we've hit pretty much with that figure 3. I think we hit most of our like highlights with what the differences are and what they found when they went through that analysis. So
yeah, I do think they have a really good discussion section that definitely adds more than we have as well. So definitely check this out. It is open access too, so it should be pretty easy to get. And they talk about the different, the different lines, like their thoughts on it. We pretty much summed up a lot of them.
So Mike, just take us home. What's the conclusion? What was the conclusion after all this?
Yeah, and this is what we talked about off air. I feel like it's similar to what we talked about at the beginning of the year with our minimal effective dose discussion too. Is that it's really all about intensity again. You can manipulate the volume and frequency however you want to, but then again, intensity really matters, and then also knowing what you're trying to affect. Like if I'm trying to work on max power, I want more specific intensities, while max strength or like sprinting, like I just want to be as high of an intensity as I can without hurting myself.
Yeah. I mean, it comes down with just doing that sort of sprinting is specifically. I think it's just being able to like sprint. Like that's gonna improve sprinting. Where I feel like with resisted training, again, it's all about they use like strength, heavy loads. Where vertical jump, you're gonna see that 30% powers, moderate loads to set 40 to 70 of 1RMs. So I think it's again, change of direction. They don't really mention it that much, but very similar to sprinting is it's very specific. So in order for you to get better at it, you need to do it. And then, like you said, the intensities are dependent. And the intensity, again, like with this, it's not also like just the load on the bar. It's also like the intent and the velocity potentially, especially when it comes down to vertical jumping, performance, and power output. So those are also ways to measure intensity too.
Yeah, and this is going beyond the article too, but like if you're working, especially if you're working with athletes, like in a return to sport process, like athletes need all 5 of these domains in a good rehab program. Also, like if you're working on the strength and conditioning side, like your strength and conditioning program should touch on all of these at least in the week. Like you don't need to be sprinting every day, but maybe you have like one sprint day, one change of direction day, like however you need to set it up.
And I think going back to that return to play, I think it's just knowing the sport that they're going back to. And I know the big hot word is reverse engineer, but knowing what is like critical for that specific sport is what that sort of change direction or sprint looks like. I'm not going to do the same thing for a ice hockey player that I would a cross country runner. Unfortunately, very different sports. You're going to have a lot more excel decels in sort of the hockey aspect, where more of the cross country, and Mike, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it's again about the improving endurance and just withstanding the amount of like total distance that they accumulate during whether it's a training session or within a race. So I think that's where I believe, again, just knowing the sport to be able to kind of make those decisions based on these domains and how effective and what you need to dose in order to be effective in return to play.
Yeah, exactly. Like if you're thinking purely specificity of like what are you doing in the sport, like cross country runners, track runners, they aren't doing a lot of change direction. There's a lot of left turns on the track.
So you're saying you're admitting it's similar to NASCAR.
Yeah, it totally is. But yeah, so like there's other benefits to training change of direction, like especially for like bone health. But for someone like in your example, a cross country runner versus a hockey player, I definitely care a lot more about change of direction with a hockey player than with a runner.
But, I mean, that's obviously out of without context involved of injury and anything like that. But I think it's just, again, knowing the person sitting in front of you, what they need to get back to or want to get back to is like one of the biggest things. And then being able to kind of give them the ability to be appropriate when it comes to dose response and giving them what, like, whether it's jump or power output or strength, like knowing that it comes down to the intensity aspect.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a good place to wrap it up. So as always, we appreciate you. If you've listened this far, please leave us a nice rating on Spotify, Apple Music, or Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Instagram at Reading Rehab Pod. And thanks.